all of the different letters, but the headline here is that the original letters that came to TMZ and local TV stations in Tucson, there were 2 letters. They threatened to kill Nancy Guthrie. We had not heard that until now.
He walked right up to her front door like he belonged there, masked, gloved, carrying a heavy backpack that shifted on his shoulders with every step. But then he did something so awkward, so strangely clumsy, that it stopped a seasoned FBI profiler in his tracks. If you're as intrigued by this as I am, make sure to subscribe and stay with me until the end. This one gets really weird. Let me paint the picture for you. It's the middle of the night in a quiet neighborhood in the Catalina foothills outside Tucson. The kind of peaceful place where folks know their routines and feel safe in the silence. At 1:47 in the morning, the doorbell camera at Nancy Guthrie's home suddenly goes dark. Someone deliberately took it offline. Then, just after 2, the system picks up movement on the property, but there's no video, no clear record at all. And a few minutes later, the signal from Nancy's pacemaker simply drops. She's no longer inside the house she had returned to earlier that evening after a quiet family dinner. That's the moment everything changed. Nancy was 84 years old. She had built a gentle, steady life there, the kind many of us dream of in our later years. After losing her husband suddenly when her children were still young, she raised them with quiet strength and grace. She worked at the university, created programs that brought music and comfort into hospital rooms, and stayed deeply involved in her church community. She preferred staying in the background, being the steady anchor for her family, while her daughter Savannah faced the cameras and the spotlight. Nancy dealt with hearing loss and needed daily medication to manage her health. Without those medicines, every hour away from home carried real worry. But on that night, none of that seemed to matter to the person who stepped onto her porch. Here's where things start to feel really off. When the doorbell camera footage finally came out, it didn't show someone sneaking around in the shadows or forcing their way in through a side window. Instead, the man walked straight up to the front door. Bold, almost casual, like he expected it to open without trouble. He tried to cover the lens first with his gloved hand, rushed and unsure. When that didn't work, he stepped away for a second, grabbed a broom that was sitting nearby, and tried to jam it against the camera. It looked improvised, almost desperate. Jim Clemente, who spent more than 20 years with the FBI and over a decade in the Behavioral Analysis Unit, studied that exact moment carefully. He didn't see a cold, tactical professional. He saw someone who had planned just enough, but didn't have the real experience to back it up. The backpack looked heavy, full of tools and supplies he thought he might need. There was even a holstered gun visible. Enough preparation to know this wasn't pure impulse. But the way he approached the house, the hesitation of the camera, those little tells suggested this might very well have been his first time stepping into something this serious. A real professional would have scouted the cameras first, found a blind spot, or disabled the system long before stepping into view. This man walked straight into the light and then fumbled when things didn't go exactly as he pictured. That single awkward reach for the broom, it changes everything. It makes you wonder, did he feel safe enough to walk right up because he thought Nancy might recognize him? Or was he counting on some false sense of control that so many of us carry when we think we've planned for every possibility? Because if he believed she would open the door willingly, then this stops feeling like a random crime and starts feeling far more personal. And that's when the questions get heavier. Who walks up to someone's front door in the middle of the night wearing a mask, yet moves like the house is already half familiar? But we're getting a little ahead. Let's sit with that image for a moment. The quiet house, the sudden darkness of the camera, the lost signal from her pacemaker. The family still hoped at first that maybe something medical had happened. When they arrived the next morning and found the house empty, the front door slightly ajar in a way that didn't feel right, and traces of blood on the porch that later confirmed belonged to Nancy, that hope began to fade. Her phone and purse were still inside. Everything she would normally take with her was left behind. That's when the ordinary night turned into something much darker. The more investigators looked at the man on that porch, the less the professional story held up. One clumsy moment with the broom had already started peeling back the first layer of what we thought we knew. And if he wasn't a hardened professional, then who was he really counting on when he walked up to her door that night? The more you watch that doorbell footage, the less it feels like some calculated professional operation. Jim Clemente kept returning to the same quiet observation. This man likely had never done anything like this before. He had the gear, the mask, the gloves, the heavy backpack, even the gun, but his choices underneath told a different story. A seasoned operator would have studied every camera angle ahead of time. He would have slipped in from the side or found a way to stay hidden. Instead, this man walked straight to the front door as if he expected it to open for him. Then he hesitated, first with his hand, then grabbing whatever was close, that broom, like an afterthought when things didn't go smoothly. That quiet confidence is what stays with me. It suggests he believed Nancy might simply open the door without fear. Maybe he counted on some level of familiarity, some face or voice she wouldn't immediately question. And if that's the case, then the circle of who we're looking for starts to feel a little closer to home. At first, many of us pictured a total stranger, someone who picked Nancy because she lived alone, because she was older and dealing with hearing loss and daily medication. The Bitcoin ransom demands that appeared afterward seemed to support that idea. Cold, transactional. But Clemente wasn't convinced. He noticed the demands felt messy. They were posted publicly instead of kept private. The instructions contradicted each other. It didn't carry the clean, calculated feel of someone whose only goal was money. It felt more like someone trying to create fear, to perform control, to pull the family through something deeply psychological. So the suspicion gently shifted. What if this wasn't random at all? What if the man on the porch had already been part of Nancy's everyday world? Someone who knew her routines, when she came home from family dinners, when the house sat quiet at night, how she moved through her days. A repair technician, a delivery driver, even someone from the edges of her church community. The kind of person you see often enough that your guard naturally lowers. Those ordinary encounters give someone the map they need without ever raising suspicion. And that's when the second layer settles in, a little heavier than the first. If he expected her to open the door, then this stops feeling like a random crime and starts feeling personal. Not necessarily someone she knew intimately, but someone close enough in her daily life that the approach felt safe in his own mind. Clemente laid it out plainly. This suspect showed flashes of planning, but he lacked the steady discipline of someone who had done this before. An amateur can watch the documentaries, study the cases, even rehearse the moves in his head, but when the moment arrives, instinct takes over. And that's exactly where the mistakes appear. The kind that don't vanish just because you wear a mask. But here's the part that truly tugs at the heart. Nancy had lived such a gentle, private life. After losing her husband so suddenly when her children were young, she poured herself into raising them with steady love and determination. She worked at the university, created programs that brought music and comfort into hospital rooms for patients who needed it most. She stayed deeply rooted in her church, offering quiet help to others without ever seeking attention. She preferred the background, being the calm presence that held her family together, while her daughter Savannah stepped into the public eye. Nancy wasn't chasing the spotlight. She simply wanted to live peacefully in her home, surrounded by the routines and faith that gave her comfort in her later years. So why her? Why this house on this particular night? The more the profiler examined the evidence, the more he wondered if the real motive ran deeper than money. Perhaps it was something more personal, a hidden resentment and obsession, or a twisted sense of payback that only made sense inside the perpetrator's own thoughts. Those kinds of drives don't always need an obvious trigger that outsiders can see. Sometimes the anger finds a nearby target, someone who quietly represents whatever wound has been growing. And when that kind of force takes hold, the behavior changes. The person takes risks they don't need to take. They linger longer than they should. They leave behind small inconsistencies that don't fit a simple financial plan. That's exactly the pattern Clemente began to see. The public ransom notes felt more like performance than pure transaction. The way the demands were broadcast seemed designed to spread fear as much as to collect anything. And if the goal wasn't simply money, then the man on the porch might have been carrying something much heavier in his heart when he walked up those steps. This one detail quietly changes everything we thought we knew about the kind of person who did this. Because if he wasn't a hardened professional, and he wasn't a complete stranger either, then the circle of suspicion starts moving closer to the edges of Nancy's everyday world. Someone who had watched her long enough to believe he could walk right up and be let in. And that possibility? That's when the tension really begins to settle in your chest. Because the mistakes he left behind aren't just tactical errors. They're deeply human ones. The kind that come from someone who thought he had control, right up until the moment he realized he didn't. The weeks kept slipping by, and the silence around Nancy's disappearance grew heavier with each passing day. No clear proof of life, no simple answers. Just the quiet ache of not knowing what had happened to her. Clemente has seen this pattern before, and he spoke honestly about what often happens with someone who has no real criminal experience. The weight doesn't stay neatly hidden. It begins to show in the small, everyday fractures of life. The person becomes unusually aware of how they look. Maybe a sudden new haircut, different clothes, or they start avoiding the places they used to go. If they used a vehicle that night, it might suddenly receive an obsessive cleaning, or even disappear for a while, perhaps repainted or tucked away somewhere. They invent reasons to leave town, a made-up family emergency, a sudden work obligation, anything that creates distance and gives them a story that sounds believable. But the deepest cracks usually form on the inside. The stress starts leaking out in ways that people close to them can't help but notice. They become more irritable or strangely withdrawn. They pull away from normal routines, cancel plans they once looked forward to, call in sick more often, or sit in long silences that feel uncomfortable. Someone carrying something this heavy for the first time rarely returns to their old self without those quiet changes showing through. Those behavioral shifts can become more revealing than any physical evidence because they show the pressure building behind the face they're still trying to keep calm. That's the kind of pattern investigators keep watching for. Not dramatic confessions, but the small, human cracks in someone who was once part of Nancy's everyday world. A repair technician, a delivery driver, someone from the edges of her church community. Anyone who had enough quiet access to learn her routines without ever raising suspicion. The kind of person she might have let in without a second thought because they simply felt familiar. And yet, even with all that careful attention, the family has been publicly cleared. No one in Nancy's immediate circle has been named as a suspect or person of interest. The sheriff's department has been clear about that. They continue treating this as an active abduction case, following every lead, including the Bitcoin demands and the physical traces left behind. They've searched properties, examined vehicles, and even gone to great lengths inside the family home itself. But the man on that porch remains in the shadows for now. Here's where another layer turns, a little more quietly this time. If the motive wasn't purely about money, and the suspect wasn't a hardened professional, then the real force behind it might have been something far more personal. A twisted sense of retribution, or an obsession that only made sense inside his own mind. Those kinds of motives don't always need a clear, obvious trigger that the rest of us can see. Sometimes the anger finds a nearby target, someone who quietly stands in for whatever wound has been growing. And when that kind of drive takes over, the behavior doesn't follow a tidy script. The person takes risks they don't need to take. They stay longer than they should. They leave behind little inconsistencies that don't match a simple, calculated plan. Clemente has emphasized that in cases like this, the answers often hide in the smallest details. A subtle shift in someone's behavior, a gut feeling about a familiar face that suddenly feels wrong, or one of those invisible cracks that only appears when the pressure becomes too much. Because this suspect doesn't have the experience to cover every trace perfectly, his mistakes are likely to surface sooner or later. The DNA, the vehicle movements, the quiet changes in daily life, they all add up over time. Right now, the investigation remains active and intense. The Pima County Sheriff's Department says they're chasing every citizen tip and won't stop until they've followed every possible lead. They believe the distance to the person responsible is slowly closing, even when it doesn't always look that way from the outside. But without confirmed proof of life after so many weeks, the reality grows more difficult with each passing day. Nancy's health needs made every hour matter, and that quiet urgency still hangs over the entire situation. The family has spoken openly about the pain of waiting, of recording messages into what sometimes feels like emptiness, hoping the right person is listening. They've stayed united in public, even as the pressure tested every part of their bond. Savannah has shared how surreal it feels to wonder whether her own visibility might have somehow pulled danger toward the one person who always chose to stay in the background. Her brother felt from the very beginning that this wasn't random, that someone saw an opportunity connected to the family's public life. Those questions still linger, even as authorities continue to say the family are victims, not suspects. So where does that leave us after walking through all these layers? A man who walked up to the door with surprising confidence, fumbled the camera in a way no professional would, and may have been driven by something far more personal than money. Someone who is probably still moving through ordinary routines right now, trying to act normal, while small cracks keep forming beneath the surface. What really haunts me about this is how someone can plan just enough to step across that line, then discover the weight they're carrying is so much heavier than they ever imagined it would be. I'm not entirely sure what the full truth will look like when it finally comes to light, but I can't stop thinking about how the smallest misstep often comes from the deepest unseen pressure inside a person. The kind that makes them believe they can control something they never really could. Notebook. They really appreciates you watching all the way through. If this story stuck with you like it did with me, drop a like and let me know in the comments. What do you think actually happened here?